Hello, and welcome to episode 60 of Prose. This week, meet a God-fearing southern boy who people say is slow and who just can't get a break. And continue to rage against the usurpers in Jack Lee's Ants of Fire, The Legend of Telo. I continue to produce these episodes in long form, both because I am traveling out of the country right now and because I am giving the shift 3 episodes to collect data. In the meantime, feel free to let me know what you think about this instead of my usual format of 3 small stories or 3 small chunks by chatting with me through social media or emailing the show directly at prosepodcast@gmail.com. Before I go, let me remind you all that if you've not yet followed the show on social media, please do so on any and all platforms under the name @prosepodcast. The best way to really help the show out, though, is by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, what some used to call iTunes, or on any podcast service. Ratings and reviews are what help others find this podcast and help me continue onward. For the easiest access to the show, subscribe using iTunes/Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or whatever podcast catcher is your favorite. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tale, shall we? This week we have Simon, Peter, and the Roof, and Jack Lee's Ants of Fire, The Legend of Telo, parts 29 and 30, The Captive and Escape. Enjoy. Simon, Peter, and the Roof, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Simon Peter Jensen had never had an easy life. From a very early age, everyone liked to use the term slow to describe him. He thought he was rather fast, though he never came in first in the foot races on field day, but he certainly wasn't the slowest person in the world. He could clear his plate really, really fast. He could sweep up and take the trash out way faster than his little brother Johnson could. He could get ready for bed in under 5 minutes. He was fast. Simon Peter went to class on the same bus as everyone else, too. Salton, Arkansas's principal stopped using a short special bus for people that the system labeled slow roughly 8 years before Simon Peter started kindergarten. So this is just another way that Simon Peter knew he wasn't slow in the head. The only possible explanation left to him as to why people kept on using that word about him. Like most, elementary school blossomed into middle school, which flowered fully into high school in no time for Simon Peter. Time flew by fastly, so that was still another indicator to him that slow just didn't have a place in his life. In high school, Simon Peter found that the other kids were a bit quicker at doing homework than him, and in answering questions in class, and in the response time it took them to laugh at jokes, and in how quickly everyone had a date to the sweetheart dance. All the girls were already taken by the time he got to them. Simon Peter was getting slower as he aged, he assumed. His senior year, though, he had a brilliant idea. His big dream was to escape from Salton, Arkansas to Tension, Arkansas, the nearest big city that had a Best Buy and a Dairy Queen and a Super Walmart. His plan was to move there and go to college and continue on as a stock boy at the Super Walmart. He liked his job well enough right now, but he bet that he could go do some pretty amazing things and have some pretty amazing adventures if he could just get to Tension. From what the guidance counselor said, college meant that you get a better life, and anything would be better than the simple existence in Salton and the labor of carrying the term slow around day in and day out. His parents were not at all supportive. His daddy had been disabled after being in a tractor-trailer accident when Simon Peter was just a little boy. Since then, his daddy just sat in his recliner and watched TV all day. If Simon Peter or Johnson were too loud or too silly or too imaginative or too slow, Daddy would strike them. "Spare the rod and spoil the child, the Bible says," is what he'd repeat as he would give them a whack to the head and then some lashes to the legs from the box fan's electrical cord. His mama earned all the money in the household. She worked 2 jobs. She worked at the Walmart in town as a checker. That's how Simon Peter got his job as a stock boy. She put in a good word with management there in Salton. Mama also worked as a secretary for Pastor Verdi 4 days a week. She loved their church, and she loved being a Pentecostal preacher's secretary. She said so all the time. She would tell Simon Peter and Johnson that when she was around Pastor Birdie, she could feel the Holy Spirit in the air itself. The Holy Spirit and the gifts of prophecy and the tongue of the angels were strong with Pastor Birdie, and Mama had to spend a lot of time with him, even on the days when she didn't have to do any secretary duties. Mama said that Simon Peter didn't need to go to Tension, and that Tension and college were full of temptations from harlots and sodomites and atheists. She would have Daddy give them lashes on the legs from the box fan's electrical cord when Johnson or he got too imaginative and asked to go into Tension for a video game or to go to a movie or some other such nonsense. It was around this time that he met Miss Davies at church. She was an older lady that played the organ sometimes, an elementary school teacher that was nearing retirement, and she did think that Simon Peter was funny and kind and smart enough and could achieve his dreams. She was like a grandma, though Simon Peter had never known his grandparents. That's how he thought of her anyway. She encouraged him to go out into the world and do things. She gave him hard candies at church. She let him call her if he was ever feeling down. She always said that she tried to live like Jesus. From Simon Peter's perspective, she was living up Jesus' example. She sure was nice. Simon Peter generally listened to his parents. He was quick to say yes ma'am and yes sir, to honor his mother and father, yet another thing that he thought made him not slow at all, but he also couldn't shake the idea that Tension was his way out of this life. Though he didn't get to go to the movies, they rent a lot from their local video store that was run out of the Tesco station. And in those films, he would see wonders that God had put in this world that he'd never see in Salton. And Simon Peter just knew that God wanted him to see them. Why else would he put them in the world and then allow Simon Peter to see them in these movies? So, toward the end of his senior year, when the military men came around, as they did every year in April, in their fancy uniforms to recruit the young men of Salton, Simon Peter signed with the Navy. He would see the world and have a fancy job to boot. He signed with the Navy because he liked the way that the all-white dress uniform the man wore shone. It looked like the light of God was shining down on that uniform, and that seemed like a sign from the Almighty himself. No matter that Simon Peter was 17, couldn't swim, never left the state, failed his physical exams, and received the lowest scores on the ASVAB and aptitude tests they gave him, the Navy needed men, and Simon Peter was signed in, ready and willing to go. His parents were angry, but they said that at least a military man was a respectable man, so long as he didn't go off and get girls pregnant or get any tattoos. Miss Davies tried to be excited for him, but she seemed more sad and scared. He generally had come to run ideas by her because she always had such good advice and really cared for him. So she was shocked when he did this all on his own. She said that it was okay, though, because he was a man and that was his right. Just like the flash of kindergarten to 12th grade, basic training zipped by in an uneventful blur. The one thing that stuck with Simon Peter from that period of time was that he just couldn't swim. He failed his swimming tests over and over again, yet he got to stay in the program. His trainers would just joke and tell him that he'd better hope he'd never fell off the boat. Those failures aside, basic was just like high school. All the other new recruits were a bit quicker at doing homework than him, and in answering questions in class, and in response time it took them to laugh at jokes, and in the physical tests, and in how quickly everyone had plans for the scant few weekends they were free. That was okay, though, because Simon Peter, at the end of it all, got assigned to an enormous aircraft carrier. He thought he could jump over the moon when he got his assignment. His aircraft carrier was actually responsible for the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, which meant that his tour of duty would see him seeing so many of those wonderful God-given places from the movies. England, France, Portugal, Italy, Greece. The list went on and on. In Italy, he had a man on the dock paint a picture of his mama in oil paints from a photo he always kept in his wallet. The man ended up charging him double because the lighting in the picture was a bit dim, but that was okay. Simon Peter had this happen all the time when he tried to purchase things. He just had bad luck was all. He was so proud of that painting and shipped it right home to Mama. When he called her up after he knew that it would have arrived in Salton, she said it was too fancy and that she'd put it in the closet, and Even though that's not quite the best response he had hoped for, Simon Peter was so happy that his mama thought it was fancy. He'd gotten her something expensive and fancy from Italy. He had gotten a second painting commissioned too, this one of Miss Davies. Miss Davies, unlike his mama, oohed and gooed and said she seemed like a royal in the picture he'd had done of her from another wallet-sized photo he'd had with him. She hung it up right away. He felt like he was a king. On the boat, Simon Peter's job was to clean the bathrooms, mop the floors, and peel loads of potatoes as part of KP. When the bathrooms were particularly messy, or the floors had some vomit or pee on them, or the vegetables he was peeling were way more rotten than what everyone else in the kitchen were, Simon Peter would think that his crewmates were playing mean tricks on him. They seemed to snicker a lot, and he still caught the word slow being mumbled from time to time, but he knew the military was a great deal more professional than what those kids and teachers were like in high school. So he chalked those thoughts up to temptations from the devil to lead him astray, or to his being too imaginative like Daddy used to whip him for when he was a little boy. His years in the Navy went by quickly, too. He was in for 8 years right out of high school, and upon exiting the service honorably at the age of 26, Simon Peter knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life and what college was for him. He wasn't going back to tension. He'd go to a school that was focused on making movies, and he'd go in Florida, where it was sunny and where his mama had dreamed of going since she was a little girl. So he did just that. His parents were disappointed because they said the movies were for dreamers and that most of the people who worked in them were harlots or sodomites. Miss Davies was proud of him for wanting to go to school, but she constantly told him to be careful, like he was going to get hurt or something. Sometimes grandmothers sure seemed to be a bit too protective. Quickly, his school's tuition got raised time and time again, but they explained all this to him, and it was legitimate. Quickly, his roommates locked him into a lease where he seemed to be paying a lot more than everyone else in rent and utilities, but they explained all this to him, and it was logical. Quickly, Simon Peter realized that college was way harder than high school or the Navy were, and he saw his classmates were a bit quicker at doing homework than him, and in answering questions in class, and in the response time it took them to laugh at jokes, and in the practical labs where they had to make sets and do makeup and arrange lighting and work with the cameras, and how quickly everyone paired up, and how he never seemed to find a partner. Within 4 semesters, Simon Peter was forced to withdraw from school, break his lease, and move home. He'd used all his money he'd saved from the Navy and the funds the GI Bill afforded him for college. He went back to work at the Walmart as a stock boy, which was okay. He had money enough to go to a movie now and again in tension, and that was neat. At 29, he found himself in a bit of hot water. Pastor Verity had loaned Simon Peter a laptop, and Simon Peter loved taking the laptop to the library in tension where he could get on the internet and talk to people. In particular, Simon Peter tried to find a girlfriend because he'd never found one before. Through the laptop, Simon Peter met a girl named Casey that really seemed to like him, but she turned out not to be real. Casey ended up being a policeman that thought that Simon Peter was a pervert that liked little girls. When a bunch of policemen in cars with flashing lights turned up to his house in Salton, Simon Peter was surprised. When the policeman said that he was in trouble for having tried to make dates with Casey, Simon Peter was surprised. When the policemen found dirty pictures and evidence of dirty websites being visited on the laptop, Simon Peter was the most surprised and hurt he'd ever been. He tried to explain that Pastor Verity is the one that gave him the laptop, but no one seemed to care or listen. Mama never said anything at all. He signed a paper so he wouldn't have to be in the courtroom in front of everyone and admit to seeing those nasty pictures or talking to Casey online. Prison was a lot like the Navy, and he stayed to himself, working in the laundry and the kitchen. He volunteered to clean the bathrooms and help in the library. That helped pass the time. Those papers that he signed ended up meaning he got to go to a nicer prison than a lot of people did. His lawyer from the state said that they could get him a lighter sentence since he didn't fully know what he was doing on the computer with those pictures and with Casey, on account of him being slow and all. Simon Peter hated that he had to tell the whole world that he was slow on a real certified official document. But he also knew that he didn't want to go to Simstown, the bigger, badder prison, where most people came back, haunted or broken or not at all. Several men from Assault had been prisoners there at one time or another, and they all had hurt in their eyes, or doled out hurt with their hands. Simon Peter didn't want to be like them. His parents stopped talking to him. They chose not to sign up to be official visitors. Miss Davies wasn't angry. She wasn't even disappointed. She just seemed sad. She did sign up to be an official visitor, and she came twice a month on visiting days, always bringing a pineapple upside-down cake for him to share with the guards on duty during visit time. She always cried on those visits, but told him that God forgives everything and that this didn't have to define him. His 7 years in prison weren't too bad. They also went by in even more of a flash than the Navy had. Simon Peter ended up feeling rather at home in prison. Prison was easy and the rules were clear, unlike real life. Not fully understanding the rules of the world had always made Simon Peter a bit uncomfortable, and now that he'd been somewhere where they'd been absolutely crystal, he was even more aware of his inability to fully grasp the things he was or wasn't supposed to do and when he was or wasn't supposed to do them. He went back home to Salton and his parents' house again after prison. Daddy had passed when he was locked up, so it was just Mama and Johnson and him now. Mama still worked for Walmart and the pastor. Johnson got a job sorting at the Goodwill. Simon Peter wasn't allowed to work for Walmart anymore because of his being a convicted pervert, so he got a job with a roofing outfit that his mama knew from church. Now 40, on his second week of roofing, Simon Peter fell through a roof of a 2-story house and broke his back, and a whole lot of other bones right along with it. He was laid up in bed and would be for the better part of a year. His mom was glad that he'd been hurt while he was on the job. This way, they got a disability check just like they used to with Daddy. That meant that she and Johnson could keep working, but without fear of not being able to make the bills because of a cut shift here or a sick day there. Them working, though, meant that Simon Peter was at home alone from early in the morning until late in the evening, 7 days a week. Miss Davies came over once a week when she could. That was nice. Most of the time. Miss Davies often talked to Simon Peter about how humans have destructive tendencies, particularly when they are left to their own devices and straying from God's will. She would tell Simon Peter that people doing themselves in was about as natural as a bird singing or a bee buzzing. Simon Peter had always respected Miss Davies and how smart she was and all her degrees and she'd had when she's trained to be a teacher, so he thought she was pretty right about all that stuff. All that talk was normally okay, but not this week. Simon Peter was excited to watch the royal wedding of Britain's Prince Harry and the American Meghan Markle. He loved all the fancy clothes and fancy places, and he'd always loved the idea of weddings and being married. In fact, one of his greatest dreams had always been to fall in love, get married, have kids, and be a daddy himself. He'd be the kind of daddy that hugged his kids and didn't lash them when they were bad. He'd also be the kind of daddy that encouraged his kids to be imaginative. He'd read books to them. He'd read books to them and watch Sesame Street and play games. They'd live in Imagination Land all together and they'd be happy. And they'd come out of Imagination Land for church and school and meals and things, but the love and smiles would never ever stop. That is what he was in search of when he tried to talk to Casey online and got into all his troubles with the law. Now that he was 40 and still didn't have a wife or a family, he was getting sadder and sadder that it would never happen. This royal wedding gave him a chance to live a wedding even grander than the one he had in his imaginations. Where he had dreamt of mason jars with lemonade and the barn repurposed with pretty lights and bench seating filled with all his friends from church and Pastor Verity up front reading from the Bible and Mama beaming proud up at him and the fiddle player that played downtown every other Saturday scratching out a jig tune. This wedding promised castles, real castles, and gowns and celebrities and so much more. So, when Miss Davies showed up right in the middle of the televised festivities, Simon Peter was upset. He wanted to focus on the royal wedding, and here was Miss Davies showing up to remind him of just how alone he was. As he listened to her asking him how he was and when he might be able to start attending church again, he listened with his other ear to the TV and all the pomp from the wedding. When the bride herself came into full view on the screen, Simon Peter began to cry. Tears carved tracks down his scruffy face. Miss Davies had never seen Simon Peter cry, though he did a lot just when he was alone. Daddy had always said that men don't cry, period. Mom had always said that men don't cry in front of people. His tires quieted Miss Davies for a bit. She eventually found her voice again and asked him what was wrong. She asked if he was okay. The ceremony continued to progress, and Simon Peter's head swam with the question. Without thinking very much, he knew the right response for the first time in his life. He had a quick response to a question. He wasn't slow. Miss Davies, she's just so beautiful. When will I ever find my princess? When will I ever find my princess? His voice got heavy then, cracked, and his additional comments became gasping, heaving sobs. The tears came quickly and freely. Miss Davies tried to comfort him as best she could, petting the left side of his head, the only place on him that wasn't wrapped, bandaged, cast, or sewn back together. She smiled her grandmotherly smile, continuing to pet, and told him it would be okay. Some people just took life a little slower than others. That was the first and only time Miss Davies had ever used the word slow towards Simon Peter in all the years they'd known one another. Simon Peter wept harder and turned the volume up on the TV. Thank you for listening to Simon Peter and the Roof. Yet another story I must admit is quite near and dear to me. Additionally, I enjoyed speaking with my accent on, so to speak. It's not all too often that I get to drawl anymore, so thank you for allowing me that as well. All of the musical tracks in the background of this story come from freemusicarchive.org. They are all being used under CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. Next up, we have one of the final 3 installments of Jack Lee's Ants of Fire, The Legend of Telo. Let's jump right back into the world and see what adventures still await us here at the end of our story. Ants of Fire, The Legend of Telo, a novel by Jack Lee. Parts 29 and 30, The Captive and Escape. Part 29, The Captive. The Queen turned her head towards Telo and faced her. I know you belong to me, but you'll have to tell me who you are. I am one of the 6. One of the eggs you sent out into the sun. I'm here to free you. Are you alone? Yes. They've bound my wings and my legs. I cannot move. How did you get in here? Does anyone know you're here? The drone. It makes me so happy to hear someone not refer to that thing as king. Does he know you're here? I was going to kill him, but he flew away. That's him for you. Always running. Here, cut these bindings so we can get out of here. Telo crawled around the Queen's body, using her pincers to cut through the bindings. She climbed onto her back and freed her wings. The Queen immediately stretched her wings out, raking them against the walls of the room. That feels good. I feel like I haven't been able to stand or move in a long time. I don't know the best way out. If we go out the way we came, we'll end up back in the drone's quarters, Your Highness, but I don't know how to leave from here. I'm sure we can sniff something out between the 2 of us, child. Telo and the Queen traced back through the corridor. You are a soldier? Yes. Well, what happened to the others? Where is your egg? The others have started a new colony. They did not want to come free you, but I was not given an egg. My nurse hatched me and raised me. I think I was supposed to be a queen, but I didn't come out right. You were supposed to be a queen and didn't come out right? The queen said. Telo's story carried more than a hint of suspicion. I gave your egg a name, though. Yes, you did. You gave me a name. A soldier with a name. Remarkable. I named 4 of the 6 eggs. The other 2 were supposed to be males. Are you Telo, Simi, Miro, or Sama? You remembered those names? A queen remembers all of her children, no matter how numerous or varied. I'm Telo, Your Highness. Telo! That was my favorite name of the 4. Thank you for remembering me, Telo. Telo felt herself becoming overwhelmed. She fell to the ground and began sobbing. Telo, what is wrong? You're real. I felt so alone. My nurse was so disappointed in me. Our family that I've met, they didn't understand me, and here you are, and I don't know what I feel. Home? Yes, that's it. I feel home. The queen turned to Telo and smiled. Your mother is where your home is, even in this place that nature has forsaken. Speaking of home, where will we be starting over? There's a hole in the ground I share with my nurse. It should be large enough for us to start over. I'm sure it will be a fine dwelling. I'm concerned with being able to start over, however. Do you think I won't be able to protect you? No, it's not that. I have not produced any new young since I have been held captive. The drone only kept me around in case he ran out of workers, which he was eventually going to do. He was not going to breed, which is why he has been able to live for so long. I don't know how he thought I was going to produce workers when he was using my eggs to what, Your Highness? I'd rather not discuss that. I tried to thwart the drone by holding my eggs in my body, not letting them come out. I eventually held them in my body until I could not produce any more. Everything inside me is dried up, child. So I'm unfertilized, and will need to mate before I can give birth to new eggs. Telo and the queen entered the drone's chambers. They did not know that their voices had echoed through the corridor. They had not been speaking in private. There is no one to mate with you. The drone's voice rang from the cave at the top of the room. And we know I'm not going to, mother. Part 30. Escape. No creature in nature avoids his purpose. You will serve yours and me, the queen said. You won't have the time. I've alerted our benefactors. They will be here shortly to assist in maintaining my rule. Your rule? Telo called out. The queen bounded into the air and flew to the opening where she heard the drone's voice. He cowered in the corner, frightened of both the queen's anger and her towering size. You have betrayed your colony and nature. You've made treaties with our enemies and created abominations. I just wanted to live, mother. Look what you've done. Look at all this that you have done. These are the workings of a male that has lived for too long. Males? The sound of hurt and fear quivered through the drone's voice as he spoke. We are always just males to you. Yet, the females are daughters. I do usually keep them around longer. Is it easier for you to breed with males? Is it easier to kill males? Would it dirty your task if you referred to us as sons? It is your purpose. The king stood and raised his head to the queen. Pride coursed through his words as he spoke. I will outlive you, mother. Our benefactors will come slaughter you and your last remaining daughters. We will find another nest of plunder for workers. My kingdom will thrive, yours will perish. Only if you think you can get away from me, male. The queen raced through the cave. The drone leapt to the other side of the room, causing the queen to crash her head into the wall. He spread his wings and took to the air, scrambling through the tunnel and trying to reach the top of the cave. The queen raised her head, stretched out her wings, and shot herself upward. She soared through the air and lined her body up with the drones. He stretched his legs out and beat them faster against his body, but she was too large and fast for him to get away. She thrust her abdomen forward and connected her lower body to his. He screamed out. Normally, I would leave you to die naturally. A few moments of peace and reward for fulfilling your purpose. But you don't deserve that. The queen stilled her wings and sank down his body, grabbing his left wing in her pincher. The force of her sinking body ripped the wing from his body. She released the wing from her pinchers and let it flutter to the ground below. She looked up, watching the drone's pathetic attempt to fly with only one wing. He spun around in circles, ramming himself into the edges of the tunnel, trying to lift himself upward. He fell to the ground below, struggling to lift himself back into the air. The queen stood over his writhing body and looked at him with a sense of sadness. She wondered how it had come to this. Where had she gone wrong in giving birth to such a creature? "It is no matter," the drone said. "I'll die knowing they'll kill you." The queen heard the sounds of a scurrying army echoing through the corridors down below. "Telo! Mother!" Telo called back. "The roaches! I can't fight them all, Mother!" The queen descended into the middle of the chambers, leaving the drone broken in the cave. Roaches poured through every tunnel leading to the chambers, grinding their mouth parts and waving their antennae through the air. Telo readied herself for battle. She had only known the queen for a short time, but everything inside her told her it was her purpose to die for her now. "On my back, Telo. We're getting out of here." Telo climbed on the queen's back without hesitation. The queen's wings extended and she flew to the cave above the room. The roaches scaled the walls and crammed themselves into the opening, trying to reach Telo and the queen before they could escape. As Telo and the queen glided through the cave, the queen looked below at the drone. She descended to where he lay and touched her antennae to his. "I'm sorry, Mother," he croaked. "I didn't want to die." The queen felt a moment of pity, but only a moment. She ignored his words and darted up the passageway with Telo on her back. She looked below at the sight of her son lying broken on the ground. Telo felt a soldier's urge. It took all she had not to leap from the queen's body and drive her stinger into the drone's head. The last thing Telo saw as she and the queen left the cave was the sight of roaches surrounding the drone. "The queen has escaped. You have no way of creating new workers." The roach leader overshadowed the drone's body.
"We still have plenty of workers. We still have some of the ones left that we had before. The main ones have all been slaughtered. Even without language and weapons, they've become unruly. Once a creature becomes unruly, it does not return to a state of submission."
"We still have my royal guard. They'll work. They'll bring you food."
"We disposed of them before we enter the chambers. Look above, what do you see?"
The drone had built his chambers in a corner of the old abandoned building that had pieces of the roof missing. It was the only place in the building that enjoyed a steady flow of sunlight. It's the sun."
"It's light. You promised I would never see that disgusting illumination ever again, yet here I am, under its beams, half blinded and exposed. We abhor being exposed. We spend most of our lives evading the light."
I can figure something out."
"I don't have time for you to figure something out."
The roach lowered his mouth to the drone's head.
I'm hungry now, Your Highness.
Thank you for listening to Ants of Fire, The Legend of Telo, Parts 29 and 30, The Captive and Escape. The musical tracks in the background of this story are all from freemusic.org. They are being used under CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. That does it this week for Prose. We are getting ever nearer the end of our story, so please hang tight for that. Certainly, I hope you'll join me in 2 weeks' time for a new episode of Prose. Until then, please do love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is always stranger than fiction.